At 85, Smokey Robinson is still alive. But the world he helped create is already gone. The friends who laughed beside him in cramped Motown studios are names etched on gravestones. The voices that once answered his are now silence, and the era that crowned him a king exists only in fading memories and old vinyl. He spent a lifetime writing songs about love, longing, and forever. Yet he has lived long enough to learn the cruelest truth of all. Nothing lasts, not fame, not friendship, not even the sound of your own voice. What remains is the weight of survival. To wake up each morning as the last witness to a miracle the world can no longer feel. This is not the tragedy of falling too soon. It is the tragedy of staying, of watching your body weaken while your memories stay sharp, of carrying an entire generation inside you while time slowly takes everything else away. If Smokey Robinson's music ever helped you through a moment of love, loss, or quiet reflection, please take a second to honor that legacy. Tap like as a tribute and subscribe to this channel so these stories are never forgotten. William Smokey Robinson Jr. was born into a Detroit that was loud with ambition and quiet with struggle, a city where factories breathed smoke into the sky and dreams were forged as often as they were broken. He grew up in the North End, a working-class neighborhood where families lived close, money lived scarce, and music slipped through open windows like a promise of escape. Radios carried blues, gospel, and rhythm and blues into small apartments. And for a young boy with wide eyes and a sensitive heart, those sounds felt like lifelines. His childhood was shaped most deeply by his mother, Flossie Robinson. She was warmth in a world that offered little of it. A woman who believed words mattered, and who encouraged her son to read, to listen, and to imagine. She filled their home with language and quiet encouragement, nurturing his love for poetry long before he understood it would become his calling. His father drifted in and out of his life, but Flossie was constant, grounding, and fiercely present. To Smokey, she was safety itself. Then, when he was only 10 years old, that safety vanished. His mother died suddenly, leaving a silence that no sound could fill. For a child already learning how fragile life could be, the loss was devastating. Smokey would later admit that this was the first wound that never truly healed. From that moment on, music stopped being just something he loved. It became something he needed. Singing was no longer play. It was survival. His older sister, Geraldine, stepped in to raise him, doing her best to hold together what grief had torn apart. But childhood had already ended too early. Smokey learned how to carry loss quietly, how to turn emotion inward, how to find comfort in melody when words failed him. He spent hours listening to records by Nolan Strong, Billy Ward, and Clyde McPhatter, studying their voices as if they were textbooks. He sang along, mimicked phrasing, practiced harmonies, and taught himself how to feel through sound. At school, he was not the loudest or the most confident child, but he was observant. He watched people. He listened to how they spoke about love, disappointment, and longing. Those observations would later become the backbone of his songwriting. Even as a teenager, he understood something many adults never do, that the smallest emotions often carry the deepest truths. By high school, Smokey had formed his first vocal group, the Five Chimes, which later evolved into the Matadors. They rehearsed wherever they could, in basements, living rooms, and hallways, chasing harmonies after long school days. There was no certainty of success, only persistence. Detroit did not offer easy paths out, and most boys he knew were expected to end up on factory floors. But Smokey carried a different vision. He did not just want to sing, he wanted to write songs that would last longer than pain. Those early years were not glamorous. They were shaped by grief, modest living, and an unspoken fear that nothing would come of his dreams. But they also forged his greatest gift: empathy. Every lyric he would later write about love and loss was rooted in this time, in the boy who learned too young that joy is fragile and that memory is powerful. Long before the world knew his name, Smokey Robinson was already becoming the poet of heartbreak. Fate rarely announces itself when it arrives. For Smokey Robinson, it did not come with trumpets or certainty, but with a meeting in Detroit that quietly rewrote the future of American music. In the late 1950s, the Matadors were performing wherever they could find a stage: talent shows, small venues, community halls, singing with hope louder than their circumstances. They were good, but goodness alone was never enough to escape Detroit's gravitational pull. What changed everything was a thin notebook Smokey carried everywhere, filled with handwritten lyrics, verses born from loss, longing, and observation. When Berry Gordy Jr. first heard Smokey sing, he heard promise. But when he saw that notebook, he saw destiny. Page after page of finished songs written by a teenager who spoke about love with the emotional precision of someone far older. Gordy later admitted that he had never seen anything like it. In Smokey, he did not just see a singer, he saw the soul of a movement waiting to be born. That partnership became the cornerstone of Motown. When Gordy founded the label in 1959, later to be known as Motown Records, Smokey Robinson and his group were among its first artists. The Matadors soon became the Miracles, and with that name change came a transformation far greater than branding. They were no longer just young men chasing opportunity. They were shaping a sound that would travel far beyond Detroit. The breakthrough arrived with Shop Around in 1960. It became Motown's first million-selling single, and with it, Smokey Robinson's voice entered homes across America. The song was simple, warm, and honest, carrying a message that felt familiar and intimate. It was not aggressive or flashy. It felt like advice whispered from one heart to another. That was Smokey's gift. He did not shout love. He confided it. As the Miracles climbed the charts, Smokey became Motown's quiet architect. While other artists dazzled with presence, he worked endlessly behind the scenes, writing songs not only for his group, but for the entire label. My Girl for the Temptations, My Guy for Mary Wells, Ain't That Peculiar for Marvin Gaye. Each song carried his signature: gentle imagery, emotional clarity, lyrics that sounded effortless but cut straight to the truth. Berry Gordy trusted him completely. Smokey was named Vice President of Motown, a role that carried enormous responsibility. He became mentor, songwriter, producer, and emotional anchor for younger artists who were suddenly navigating fame. While others celebrated success, Smokey absorbed pressure. He was writing late into the night, recording by day, guiding careers in between. The label expanded, and with every new hit, expectations tightened around him. On stage, the Miracles were polished and elegant, embodying Motown's vision of sophistication. Smokey's falsetto floated gently above harmonies, tender yet precise, never overpowering, always inviting. Audiences leaned in when he sang. They felt seen. In a decade marked by social change and tension, his music offered connection. It crossed racial lines at a time when little else could. By the mid-1960s, Smokey Robinson was everywhere, on radios, on charts, in the DNA of Motown itself. Bob Dylan would later call him America's greatest living poet, a rare acknowledgement that spoke volumes about his influence. Yet behind the acclaim, the pace was relentless. Success did not slow the work. It multiplied it. This was the paradox of Smokey's rise. As his music brought comfort to millions, his own life became increasingly demanding. The boy who once sang to survive was now carrying the emotional weight of an entire label. Fame had arrived, but it did not come quietly. It came with responsibility, exhaustion, and the first signs that greatness always asks for a price. Success did not arrive gently for Smokey Robinson. It arrived like a tide that never receded. By the late 1960s, Motown was no longer a small Detroit dream. It was an empire, and Smokey stood at its emotional center. While audiences saw elegance and calm, his private life was being pulled apart by exhaustion, expectation, and silence. He was not only the voice of the miracles, but the pen behind countless hits, the mentor behind rising stars, and the executive expected to keep the machine running without pause. The cost of that pressure showed itself slowly. Endless studio sessions bled into sleepless nights. Touring separated him from home for months at a time. Claudette Rogers, his wife and fellow miracle, stood beside him on stage while quietly enduring her own pain. The physical toll of touring led to multiple miscarriages, losses that carved invisible wounds into their marriage. Smokey carried guilt. He did not know how to speak aloud. He wrote love songs for the world while watching intimacy slip through his own hands. Behind the polished suits and gentle smile, fatigue settled deep into his bones. Smokey was expected to be steady, graceful, unshakable. At Motown, he was the calm presence others leaned on, the man who always had the right words. But there was no space for him to fall apart. Vulnerability did not fit the image of Motown perfection, so he learned to hide it. As the 70s approached, the industry changed, and so did the weight on his shoulders. Motown expanded, relocated, evolved. Smokey's role as vice president pulled him further into boardrooms and away from the simple joy of creating. Music, once his refuge, began to feel like obligation. The act of writing, once instinctive, became pressured by deadlines and expectations. The same gift that had lifted him now demanded more than he had left to give. In 1972, Smokey made a decision that stunned fans. He stepped away from the miracles. Officially, it was about spending more time with family and focusing on leadership at Motown. Unofficially, it was an admission of burnout. Leaving the group felt like shedding a skin he had worn since boyhood, but it also left him exposed. Without the miracles, Smokey faced the terrifying question of who he was when the harmonies faded. His solo career brought moments of renewal and success, but the internal struggle continued. Fame did not quiet the unrest, it amplified it. The applause grew louder, yet the emptiness after the shows felt deeper. In that void, Smokey reached for something to soften the edges. Cocaine entered his life quietly, then insistently. At first, it felt like relief, a way to push through exhaustion, to silence doubt, to keep smiling when his spirit was tired. What began as escape turned into dependence. The drug dulled pain, but it also dulled clarity. His health suffered. His focus slipped. Relationships strained further. Those closest to him noticed the change, the distance behind his eyes, the moments when the gentle poet seemed lost inside himself. Still, he kept working. Still, he kept performing. Legends were not allowed to stop. By the early 1980s, the darkness had tightened its grip. Smokey later admitted that addiction nearly took his life. His body weakened, his spirit frayed. The man who had written so beautifully about love and resilience found himself staring into a future he might not survive. Doctors warned him plainly. If he continued, there would be no second chance. The breaking point did not come on a stage or in a studio. It came in a moment of quiet terror, when Smokey realized he was standing at the edge of everything he had built. Fame could not save him. Music could not protect him. For the first time, he faced the possibility that the voice which had defined an era might be silenced not by age, but by self-destruction. What followed was not an easy rescue, nor a dramatic comeback. It was a reckoning. Smokey has described experiencing a profound spiritual awakening, a moment that forced him to confront his mortality and his choices. He walked away from drugs not through spectacle, but through surrender. Faith became his anchor. Survival became his priority. Emerging from addiction, Smokey carried scars that never fully faded. He returned to music changed. His voice still held warmth, but now it carried gravity. Songs were no longer just expressions of romance. They were testimonies of endurance. The man who once seemed untouchable had been broken, and in that breaking, he found humility. Yet even redemption carried loss. His marriage to Claudette could not survive the accumulated years of strain, grief, and distance. Their divorce marked the end of a partnership that had shaped both his personal and professional life. Smokey did not speak of it with bitterness, only sadness. Another chapter closed quietly, without applause. By the time he stepped fully into recovery, Smokey Robinson had survived the darkest descent of his life, but the cost was permanent. He had learned that success could hollow a man just as easily as failure. And though he had escaped addiction, time itself was already preparing the next test. Survival did not bring peace. It brought time. And time, for Smokey Robinson, would become the heaviest burden of all. By the late 1980s, and into the decades that followed, he stood in a rare and painful position. He had outlived the storm of addiction, rebuilt his faith, and reclaimed his voice. Yet the world around him was slowly disappearing. The Motown family that once felt eternal was thinning, name by name, funeral by funeral, leaving Smokey carrying memories that no one else could fully share. Marvin Gaye had been gone since 1984, taken by violence that shocked the soul of music itself. Michael Jackson, a child Smokey had known since the earliest days of Motown, died suddenly in 2009, leaving a silence that echoed far beyond pop culture. Aretha Franklin, his friend and spiritual sister, passed in 2018, her voice falling quiet after decades of power. Each loss felt like another piece of history slipping through his hands. Each memorial reminded him that he was no longer standing in the middle of the story. He was standing near its end. On stage, audiences still rose to their feet. They still sang along. They still smiled through tears. But behind the curtain, Smokey felt the weight of being one of the last witnesses to an era that had reshaped America. He was no longer just performing songs. He was carrying ghosts. Every lyric summoned faces that would never sit in the audience again. Every harmony echoed voices that once stood beside him in studio hallways, now long silent. Age arrived quietly. Then, all at once, his voice, once effortless and crystalline, began to change. The falsetto that had floated above generations softened, thinned, sometimes trembling where it once soared. Smokey spoke openly about it, not with anger, but with grief. He adjusted keys, shortened sets, leaned into intimacy rather than power. Audiences did not love him less for it. In many ways, they loved him more. Yet for Smokey, each limitation felt like a farewell rehearsal, a reminder that even the most beautiful instrument is borrowed. The tragedy deepened not only in sound, but in body. Aches lingered. Stamina faded. The mirror reflected a man whose spirit felt young, but whose frame carried 80 years of living. He could no longer pretend that time was patient. He felt it in his breath, in the pauses between songs, in the careful way he stepped across the stage. For an artist whose life had been motion, slowing down felt like standing still while the world moved past him. Then came the moment that stripped away all illusion. In 2020, during the height of the global pandemic, Smokey Robinson contracted COVID-19. At 80 years old, the virus did not arrive as an inconvenience. It arrived as a threat. His condition became serious. Breathing grew difficult. Isolation replaced applause. Hospital rooms replaced green rooms. Machines replaced microphones. Smokey later admitted that he nearly died. Lying in that bed, he faced the truth he had written about for others, but never fully claimed for himself. That this could be the end. Not in song, not in tribute, but in quiet. He spoke of fear not as panic, but as clarity. Fame meant nothing there. Awards could not help him breathe. The only thing that mattered was whether he would see another morning. When he survived, gratitude followed him like a shadow. He returned thinner, slower, but profoundly changed. Life no longer felt guaranteed. Every performance felt borrowed. Every breath felt earned. He spoke differently after that, with softness and urgency woven together. Survival was no longer abstract. It lived inside him. Yet survival did not erase loneliness. At 85, Smokey Robinson lives with the strange ache of being deeply loved by millions while missing those who knew him before the world did. The friends who shared cramped studios. The collaborators who argued over lyrics at midnight. The voices that once harmonized in hallways now exist only in memory. The tragedy is not simply that he is aging, it is that he is aging alone at the edge of an era he helped build. He has said that growing old is not the hardest part. Watching your world disappear is. To stand on stage and realize you are singing not just to an audience, but for everyone who is no longer there. To feel applause that once celebrated beginnings now sound like gratitude before goodbye. This is the quiet climax of Smokey Robinson's life. Not scandal, not collapse, but endurance. The endurance of a man who has lived long enough to become history while still breathing, who carries the beauty of survival and the sorrow of time in the same fragile body. Legacy is a strange place to live while you are still breathing. For Smokey Robinson, it is not a museum of awards or a shelf of trophies. It is the quiet realization that his voice has already outlived him in the hearts of millions, even as his body continues to age in real time. At 85, he walks through a world shaped in part by his own words, yet no longer moves through it with the ease of the man who once defined its soundtrack. He does not measure his life by chart positions anymore. He measures it by mornings, by breath, by whether his voice still answers him when he opens his mouth. There is a humility in that shift that feels almost painful. The man once called Motown's poet now speaks less about greatness and more about gratitude. Gratitude for time. Gratitude for survival. Gratitude for having loved and been loved, even if loss followed close behind. His music has not faded with him. It has multiplied. New generations continue to discover My Girl, the tracks of my tears, cruisin', not as relics, but as living emotions. Couples still dance to his songs at weddings. Strangers still cry to them in the quiet of their cars. Artists who were not even born during Motown's rise still sample his melodies and quote his lyrics as scripture. Smokey Robinson did not just write songs. He wrote emotional blueprints that outlived trends, formats, and time itself. Yet legacy does not protect you from regret. Smokey has spoken candidly about the things he wishes he had done differently. Time lost with family, relationships strained by touring and pressure, moments when the pursuit of perfection cost him presence. For a man who wrote endlessly about love, he has admitted that living it was sometimes harder than singing it. Those admissions are not confessions of failure. They are the marks of a man finally allowed to be human after decades of being immortalized. In his later years, faith has become quieter but deeper. No longer a dramatic rescue from addiction, but a daily anchor. He speaks of God not as spectacle, but as companionship, a presence in silence, a reassurance when the nights stretch long and memories crowd in. Aging has stripped away his need to impress. What remains is a man at peace with imperfection. There is also a profound tenderness in how he views the future. Smokey does not speak of how he wants to be remembered. He speaks of how he hopes his music made people feel less alone, less afraid to love, less ashamed of heartbreak. If that is his epitaph, he says, "It is enough." That is not the language of an icon. It is the language of a man who has lived long enough to understand what actually matters. The tragedy of Smokey Robinson at 85 is not that he is slowing down. It is that we are watching the last living bridge to an era that taught the world how to feel softly. An era where vulnerability was not weakness and romance was not irony. When he leaves the stage now, audiences rise not only in applause, but in reverence. They know they are witnessing something finite, something fragile, something sacred. And perhaps that is the final lesson he offers. That time is not something to conquer. It is something to honor. That voices fade, bodies weaken, eras pass. But what we give to others emotionally can remain untouched by decay. Smokey Robinson's greatest legacy is not Motown. It is the permission he gave generations to feel deeply, without apology. At 85, he stands not as a man defeated by time, but as one who has walked with it long enough to understand its cost and its beauty. His story does not end in triumph or tragedy alone. It ends in truth. And in that truth lives the quiet power of a life that mattered. At 85, Smokey Robinson does not ask to be remembered as a legend. He asks only that his music continues to mean something when the lights go out. His voice may no longer soar the way it once did, but its echo lives on in first loves, final goodbyes, and quiet moments when a song says what the heart cannot. His tragedy is not that time is taking him away, but that we are slowly realizing how rare it was to have him at all. In the end, Smokey Robinson did not just sing about love. He taught the world how to feel it, and that gift will outlive every goodbye. If Smokey Robinson ever gave you a song that stayed with you, please let us know in the comment below as a tribute to his legacy. And subscribe to our channel so we can continue honoring the legends whose stories deserve to be remembered long after the music fades.